They slammed her against the hood of her own car, cuffs digging into her wrists as the corrupt cops smirked. "You're done," one of them sneered, holding up a bag of drugs they just planted. Federal agent Alex Carter had spent years undercover, unraveling their operation. Now, they were framing her for the very crimes she was investigating. With a bribed judge, falsified evidence, and no way out, her fate was sealed. Or so they thought, because in that courtroom, when the truth comes out, the ones who set her up won't just lose their case. They'll lose everything. Before we start the video, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. The city moved around her in a blur of neon lights and distant sirens, but Alex Carter never lost focus. She sat alone in the corner of a dimly lit diner, stirring her untouched coffee, her eyes locked on the reflections in the window. She wasn't looking at herself, she was watching them. Two uniformed officers laughing over their meal, their badges gleaming under the buzzing fluorescent lights. Officer Daniels and Officer Cruz, dirty cops, the kind that took bribes, planted evidence and made sure the system stayed broken. The kind she had spent months investigating. Alex had been working this case for over a year, buried so deep in her cover that even her own agency barely acknowledged her existence. That was the price of hunting corruption from the inside. You had to live in the filth, blend in with the people you were trying to take down. She wasn't Alex Carter, the federal agent, not here. To the world, she was just another resident in a city that ate people alive. Low profile, quiet, nobody worth noticing. That was the way she liked it. She took a slow sip of coffee as she listened to their conversation. They talked in code, but she had been on this mission long enough to know what they really meant. Another drop was happening tonight. More drugs being pushed onto the streets, more money exchanging hands where the law couldn't touch it. She kept her expression neutral, her pulse steady as she glanced at the time. She had everything she needed. Soon, the walls would close in on them. As she stood to leave, a sharp chill ran down her spine, a feeling, the kind you got when you were being watched. She forced herself to move naturally, keeping her pace slow and deliberate as she walked. Out of the diner and into the cold night air, something was wrong. She turned a corner, heading toward her car, and that's when she saw them. 4 officers, not in uniform, but she knew who they were. They leaned against an unmarked vehicle, casual, like they had been waiting for her. "Alex Carter," one of them called out, his voice dripping with amusement. "Or whatever name you're using these days." She didn't react, didn't break stride, but it didn't matter. They were already moving. She reached for her phone, but before she could even blink, a rough hand grabbed her wrist, twisting it behind her back. "Come on now." Another officer laughed. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She was shoved forward, her chest hitting the hood of her car as cold metal snapped around her wrists. "You're under arrest," one of them said mockingly. "Possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute." She didn't struggle, didn't speak, because she knew this wasn't a misunderstanding, this wasn't a mistake, this was a setup. Alex kept her breathing steady as they forced her into the back of the squad car. The cuffs were too tight, cutting into her wrists, but she didn't flinch. Pain wasn't the enemy here, panic was. The moment she lost control, they would win. These weren't just dirty cops looking to scare her off. No, this was calculated. They had planned this. The weight of their setup settled on her chest, but she shoved it down. Officer Cruz sat in the front seat, glancing at her in the rearview mirror with a smirk. "Funny how things work out," he mused. "One minute you're just another face in the crowd. Next minute you're looking at a life sentence." Alex didn't respond. Words were pointless now. The drive was short, too short. They weren't taking her to a precinct. That would have required real paperwork, a real process. Instead, they pulled into a quiet alley behind an abandoned building. No cameras, no witnesses. 2 of them yanked her out of the car and shoved her against the brick wall. Officer Daniels leaned in close, his breath reeking of stale coffee. "Here's how this goes," he said, voice low. "You take the charges. You plead guilty. You get a reduced sentence and keep your mouth shut." Alex tilted her head, expression unreadable. "And if I don't?" Daniel smiled. Clear and direct. But that wasn't what made her stomach turn. It was the confidence in his voice, the certainty. That meant they had everything lined up. Evidence, a judge in their pocket, maybe even someone in the DA's office. She had seen it happen before. Corrupt systems had a way of protecting their own. One of the cops reached into the back seat of the car and pulled out a clear plastic bag filled with white powder. He tossed it on the ground at her feet, then took a photo with his phone. "Congratulations," Cruz said. "You're a drug dealer now." It didn't matter that she'd never touched the stuff. That wasn't the point. The point was making it look real enough that no one would question it. She could already see the headlines. Woman found with kilos of cocaine in her apartment. No one would ask how it got there. No one would care. The moment the photo was taken, they dragged her back to the car, this time heading straight for the precinct. Inside, the processing was quick, efficient, too efficient. Her paperwork was already filled out before she even walked through the doors. She wasn't just being arrested, she was being erased. They took her fingerprints, took her mugshot, took her freedom. When they finally threw her into a holding cell, Alex sat on the cold metal bench, staring at the wall. Not in fear, not in defeat, in calculation. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. The cell smelled like sweat and desperation. The air was thick with the weight of lost causes, of people who had already accepted their fate. But Alex Carter wasn't one of them. She sat on the metal bench, back straight, eyes locked on the bars ahead. Every part of this was orchestrated, planned down to the last detail. They wanted her to feel small. They wanted her to break. A guard appeared at the door, tapping the bars with his baton. "Your lawyer's here," he said, voice laced with boredom. Alex stood, forcing her muscles to stay loose as she followed him down the narrow corridor. The room they led her into was small, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Sitting at the metal table was a man in a cheap suit, thinning hair slicked back, glasses perched too low on his nose. He barely looked up as she sat across from him. "Miss Carter," he muttered, shuffling through papers. "Let's get this over with." She watched him carefully, her instincts already telling her what she needed to know. He wasn't here to help. He was here to close the case as quickly as possible. "You don't even know who I am," she said. The lawyer sighed, rubbing his temple. "You're a woman caught with enough drugs to put you away for 20 years. That's all that matters." He slid a paper across the table. "Now the prosecution is offering a deal. Plead guilty, and they'll recommend a lighter sentence. You could be out in 5, maybe 3 with good behavior." Alex didn't even look at the paper. "And if I don't?" He finally met her gaze, and for the first time she saw it, the flicker of something behind his eyes. Not fear, not concern, just exhaustion. "Then you lose," he said simply. "And they make sure you never see the outside again." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Who got to you?" The lawyer stiffened. "Excuse me? Come on," she whispered. "You're not even trying to fight this. That means either you're incompetent or someone made sure you wouldn't put up a real defense." His jaw tightened. "You think this is some conspiracy?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The lawyer sighed, shoving the papers back into his briefcase. "I'll give you time to think about it," he muttered, standing up. "But if you know what's good for you, you'll take the deal." She watched him leave, her mind already racing. Every piece of this was stacked against her. The arrest, the evidence, the judge, and now even her own defense. They had built a perfect cage, one designed to keep her locked away forever. She exhaled slowly, centering herself. If they thought she was powerless, they were wrong. They had made one mistake. They let her live long enough to fight back. Alex sat on the cold metal bench of her cell, staring at the floor as she pieced everything together. The judge was dirty. The cops were dirty. Her lawyer was either incompetent or complicit. Every door had been shut before she could even reach it. If she played by their rules, she was done. She wasn't going to play by their rules. The key to surviving wasn't just fighting. It was waiting, letting them think they had won, letting them get comfortable. She needed information, and the Best way to get it wasn't from the outside. It was inside these walls. The holding cell was packed with women waiting for processing, most of them caught in the system, either too scared or too tired to fight back. But Alex wasn't interested in them. She was interested in the ones who knew things, the ones arms crossed, watching everything with sharp, calculating eyes. A tattoo on her wrist marked her as a low-level enforcer for the Rivera cartel, the same cartel these dirty cops were protecting. Alex didn't hesitate. She moved toward her, sitting down beside her like they had known each other for years. "You work for Rivera?" Alex asked casually. The woman tensed, but didn't look at her. "I don't know what you're talking about." Alex smirked. "Yeah, you do. And you know those cops outside? They're not just arresting people. They're working their own side hustle, taking a cut from Rivera, making sure certain shipments get through, planting drugs on people who get too close." That got the woman's attention. Her eyes flicked to Alex, suspicious. "You talk a lot for someone locked up." Alex shrugged. "I just think it's funny. Rivera's people are the ones pushing product, but these cops are the ones making the real money. Probably more than your boss." The woman's jaw tightened, the gears in her head turning. That was the thing about corruption. Everyone had an angle and no one liked being played. If she could plant even a seed of doubt, it would start to grow. Before the woman could respond, an officer banged on the bars. "Carter, you've got another visitor." Alex stood, keeping her expression neutral as they led her out. This time the meeting wasn't in the visitor's room. They took her down a different hallway, one lined with locked doors. This wasn't protocol, this was something else. When they shoved her inside, the door slammed shut behind her. "Officer." Daniels stood against the desk, arms crossed, smirking like he had already won. "I think you and I need to have a talk," he said. Alex stared at him, unflinching. "Good," she said. "I was hoping you'd say that." Daniels let the silence stretch between them, his smirk widening as he pushed off the desk and walked toward her. The dim interrogation room smelled of sweat and old cigarettes, the overhead light flickering. Alex stood still, her wrists still cuffed, her breathing slow and steady. This was their next move, a little off-the-record intimidation. "You're in deep, Carter," Daniels said, his voice full of fake sympathy. "But I'll be honest with you, this doesn't have to get worse." She didn't respond. He wanted a reaction. He wasn't getting one. Daniels sighed, pretending to be disappointed. "You don't get it, do you? We own this city. You were just another rat scurrying around thinking you were untouchable. But see, the thing about rats," he leaned in close, "is that nobody misses them when they're gone." Alex let a slow smirk curl her lips. "Then why am I still here?" Daniel's jaw tensed for half a second, just enough for her to see it. They couldn't kill her yet, not without risk. They needed her to play along, to take the plea, disappear into the system quietly. That meant there was still time. Daniels shook his head, chuckling. "You think you're special?" He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, then turned it toward her. It was a mugshot. Her own face plastered across a news headline. "Female drug trafficker caught with large stash, sentencing imminent." "They've already convicted you in the court of public opinion," he said, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "Your agency isn't coming. They've buried you. Even if you scream your real identity from the rooftops, no one will believe you." Alex looked up at him, her expression blank. He thought he was giving her bad news. He wasn't. He had just told her exactly how much time she had left. If the public believed the case was over, then that meant the trial would be rushed. If they were pushing this story already, then sentencing would come fast. Maybe a week, maybe less. She didn't have time for subtle moves anymore. She had to act now. Daniels sighed like he was bored. "Look, I don't care what you do. I'll be sleeping in my own bed tonight. You'll be rotting in here." He turned to the door and knocked twice. It swung open. Before he stepped out, he threw one last glance over his shoulder. "Think about the deal. It's the only way you get out of this alive." The second he was gone, Alex let out a slow exhale. She had let them move first, let them think she was beaten. But now it was her turn. As soon as she got back to the holding cell, she made her move. She found the woman with the cartel tattoo and sat beside her. "You want to hurt the cops screwing over your boss?" she asked quietly. The woman glanced at her, intrigued. Alex leaned in. I have a way to make it happen. The woman with the cartel tattoo studied Alex, suspicion flickering in her dark eyes. For a moment, it seemed like she might ignore her completely. Then, with a slow nod, she leaned in just enough to show she was listening. Talk fast, she muttered. Before I decide you're wasting my time. The cops you think are protecting your crew, they're not. They're robbing them blind, skimming off every shipment, double-dipping with rival dealers. Rivera's losing money, and he doesn't even know it. The Ichi woman's jaw clenched. That hit a nerve. Why should I believe you? Alex shrugged. You shouldn't. But if I were lying, why would I still be breathing? If these cops wanted me gone, I wouldn't be sitting here. The woman didn't answer, but Alex could see the wheels turning. In the cartel world, betrayal was a death sentence. If Rivera found out his so-called allies were stealing from him, there would be blood. I need a message sent, Alex continued, keeping her voice low. I need a phone call made to someone outside, someone who can prove what I'm saying. The woman's eyes narrowed. And why the hell would I risk that for you? Alex smirked. Because when Rivera finds out the truth, he'll burn those cops to the ground. And you'll be the one who brought him that information. That was the gamble. The cartel didn't play nice, but they did play for power. If she made the right move, she wouldn't just get a message out. She'd turn the very people who framed her against each other. The woman exhaled sharply. You better pray your information's solid. She stood, walking toward the back of the cell, whispering to another inmate. Seconds later, that inmate was escorted out by a guard, one of Rivera's people, planted inside the jail. A signal was sent. The message was moving. Now, Alex had to wait. Hours passed. Night fell. She stayed silent, listening to the murmurs around her. Then, just after midnight, the cell door buzzed open. The guard motioned for her. Carter, someone wants to see you. Alex's muscles tensed. She had expected a reaction, but not this fast. They led her back down the dim hall, turning a corner she hadn't been down before. Instead of another holding area, they pushed her into a room with a single metal table and a man she didn't recognize. He wasn't a cop, he wasn't a lawyer, he was cartel. Rivera's people worked fast. The man looked her up and down, expression unreadable. Then he pulled out a phone, sliding it across the table. Call, he said. Alex stared at the device. This was her shot. One call, one chance to bring everything crashing down. She picked it up, dialed the only number that mattered. The line rang once, then twice. Then a voice answered. It's me, Alex said, voice steady. It's time to move. The voice on the other end was sharp, professional. Alex? She didn't have time for explanations. Listen carefully. I was set up. Dirty cops, a corrupt judge, the whole thing. They want me buried. There was a pause. Then, we suspected something when you went dark. What do you need? Alex kept her voice low, even though she knew Rivera's man was watching her like a hawk. I have evidence, but I can't get it inside. I need you to retrieve my agency files, my undercover documentation. And I need a paper trail linking these cops to Rivera's money. That's our leverage. The man on the other end exhaled sharply. That's not easy, Alex. The agency isn't acknowledging you. Your cover was too deep. As far as they're concerned, you don't exist right now. Alex expected that. Then make them remember me. I don't care how. Just move fast. They're pushing this case to trial, and once I'm sentenced, I won't be reachable. The silence on the line stretched. But then came the response she needed. Understood. We'll make contact in 24 hours. Alex hung up, sliding the phone back across the table. Rivera's man studied her, his expression unreadable. You just made a lot of noise, he said. That call? If they're listening, your time just ran out. She met his gaze. Then I'd better make my next move count. He gave a slow, amused nod. Rivera likes people who think ahead. He's interested now. That was exactly what she wanted. They returned her to her cell before dawn, and by the time she sat back down on the metal bench, the cartel enforcer had already spread the word. Whispers moved through the holding area. Cops were dirty, money was missing, something big was coming. By morning, the shift in power had already begun. The officers walking the halls weren't as relaxed as before. They noticed the shift, the eyes on them. They had been untouchable before. Now there was a crack in their armor. Alex saw it all. The tension, the uncertainty. Then just before noon, she was pulled from her cell again. This time, it wasn't Daniels waiting for her. It was the judge. Judge Holloway sat in a small office, expression stone cold. He gestured for her to sit, but she didn't move. "You're making waves," he said, voice calm, almost bored. "That's a mistake." Alex tilted her head. "So is underestimating me." His eyes darkened. "You have one chance, Carter. Plead guilty, take the deal, walk away quietly." Alex smiled, slow and dangerous. "No." Holloway sighed, leaning forward. "Then you've signed your own death warrant." The moment the door opened, she saw Daniels waiting outside. His smirk was gone. He looked like a man ready to fix a problem, and that problem was her. Daniels shut the door behind him with slow, deliberate movements. His eyes locked on Alex like a predator sizing up its next meal. The judge leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the desk as if the whole thing bored him. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Daniels muttered, stepping forward. His usual smugness had been replaced with something else. Frustration. Good. Alex stayed still, her pulse steady. "If you're here to intimidate me, you're wasting your time." Daniels chuckled, shaking his head. "No, Carter. I'm here to end this." Judge Holloway sighed, adjusting his tie. "Your trial is moving up. Jury selection starts tomorrow. We're done playing games." Alex expected this. They wanted her silenced before any outside help could reach her, but she wasn't going to let that happen. She leaned back in her chair, feigning boredom. "So what's the plan? Another fake piece of evidence? A mysterious accident before I make it to court?" Daniels smirked. "We don't need to get our hands dirty. The jury will convict you. The evidence is airtight. And once you're inside, well," he shrugged. "Accidents happen in prison all the time." Alex kept her expression blank, but inside, she was analyzing every move. They were rushing. They were desperate. That meant the outside pressure was working. The cartel had them scared. Her agency was sniffing around, and that meant she had one last chance to blow everything open. She exhaled slowly, then looked at the judge. "You should have picked us smarter." "Got to do your dirty work?" Holloway arched a brow. "Excuse me?" Alex smirked. "You had Daniels plant evidence, falsify reports, manipulate crime scenes. He did all your heavy lifting. And now that he's panicking, he's about to make a mistake." Daniels' nostrils flared. "You're grasping at straws." But she wasn't. She was baiting him. She turned her attention to the judge again, her voice smooth, controlled. "Do you really trust a man this reckless? Someone who let an undercover federal agent live long enough to take him down?" Daniels snapped. He lunged forward, gripping her shirt, yanking her to her feet. "You think you're untouchable?" he snarled. "You're nothing, you're dead." The judge shot up from his chair. "Daniels, stop!" But it was too late. The door to the room burst open and two uniformed officers rushed in. Real officers, not dirty. Unnuz, their eyes flicked between Daniels' hands on her and the judge's alarmed expression. Silence filled the room. Alex slowly turned her head toward the officers, her face calm. "You might want to add assaulting a federal agent to his charges," she said. The officers hesitated. Then one of them reached for his radio. Daniels paled. The cracks in their control were spreading, and Alex was about to shatter everything. The moment Daniels released her, Alex took a slow step back, smoothing out her shirt. The two officers who had entered exchanged wary glances, their hands hovering near their belts. They weren't sure what they had just walked into, but they had seen enough to know something was off. Daniels was rattled, his chest rising and falling. In short, angry breaths. His face was flushed, his fingers twitching at his sides. Alex knew that look, a man who just realized he'd made a fatal mistake. Judge Holloway, however, recovered quickly. He straightened his tie, forcing a composed expression. "Officers," he said smoothly, "there's no need for... You should call internal affairs." Alex interrupted, her voice calm, professional. "Tell them a suspect in an ongoing case was just assaulted by the lead investigator. They might want to review his handling of the evidence. One of the officers hesitated before speaking into his radio. "Control, I need a supervisor in holding interview room 3. Daniels snapped his head toward him. "Are you out of your mind?" The officer didn't respond. That was the problem with corruption. It only worked when no one questioned it. But now, with even a sliver of doubt planted, everything started to unravel. Holloway sighed, running a hand down his face. "Enough of this. Officer, you're dismissed. This inmate is still entitled to due process," Alex cut in. She turned her gaze back to Daniels. "Tell me, officer, what's your plan now? More fake evidence? Or do you think you can make me disappear before Internal Affairs gets here?" Daniels said nothing. "Good." Alex pressed forward, sensing the momentum shifting. "Because I think you know that if I go down, I'm not going alone. And you, Judge Holloway? How many cases have you ruled on that were rigged like this? How many people are sitting in prison because of you?" Holloway's face remained stone cold, but the slight twitch in his jaw told her he was calculating, followed by another officer stepping inside. "IA is on their way," he said. Daniels turned to the judge, his voice low, desperate. "We need to shut this down. Now." Holloway exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. Then with one final glance at Alex, he made his decision. "She's going to trial." Daniel's head snapped toward him. "What? You already lost control," Holloway said bitterly. "If she disappears now, we go down first." He turned to the officers. "Escort her back to holding." Alex didn't resist as they led her out, but inside, she knew she had won the first battle. They weren't in control anymore. Now she just had to bury them in their own mess, in open court. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras flashing as Alex Carter was led inside in cuffs. The prosecution wanted this to look like a slam-dunk conviction, a message that no one could challenge the system and win. She let them think that. She kept her head down, her posture controlled, ignoring the whispered speculation around her. She had been framed. She had been betrayed. But today she was going to take them all down. The judge, Holloway, of course, sat high on the bench, his expression carefully neutral. But Alex saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided looking at her directly. He was worried. Good. The trial began as expected. The prosecution laid out their fabricated case with confidence, painting Alex as a drug trafficker with undeniable evidence against her. Photos, forensic reports, testimony from the same corrupt officers who had framed her, but they were too confident. They had no idea what was coming. When it was finally her turn to testify, Alex walked to the stand with calm, measured steps, her eyes scanning the jury. 12 people, 12 chances. She took a deep breath as her defense attorney, the real one, the one she secured through outside contacts once Internal Affairs started digging, stepped forward. "Miss Carter," he began, "what do you do for a living?" Alex lifted her chin, letting her voice carry through the silent courtroom. "I am a federal agent working undercover on a corruption case within the police department." The reaction was instant. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The jury's eyes widened. The prosecution immediately objected, but it was too late. Alex continued before anyone could silence her. "I was planted in this city over a year ago to investigate officers involved in illegal drug operations, the very same officers who arrested me." The lead prosecutor shot up from his seat, his face red. Objection, irrelevant and unsubstantiated. Alex's attorney turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we have the official documentation verifying my client's employment, her mission details, and communications with federal authorities." That was when it happened. The evidence file was brought into court. It contained her real credentials, agency reports, and a direct link between Holloway, Daniels, and multiple corrupt officers. Judge Holloway's face drained of color. Daniels, sitting at the prosecution's table, stiffened. The jury members glanced at each other, uncertainty creeping in. Then Alex dropped the final blow. She turned to the jury and spoke clearly, her voice sharp and controlled. "The men who arrested me didn't just frame me. They have framed dozens of people before me, people who didn't have the chance to prove their innocence. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Alex sat back, expression unreadable. The dominoes were falling, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The courtroom erupted. Shouts rang out from the gallery. Reporters scrambled to capture the chaos. Unfolding in real time, Judge Holloway slammed his gavel down repeatedly, demanding order, but it was already too late. The truth was out, and now everyone wanted a piece of it. Alex sat still, hands folded on the stand, watching the scene unfold like a controlled detonation. She had set the charges. Now, all she had to do was let them explode. The prosecution was panicked. The lead attorney stumbled through another objection, his voice shaking as he insisted the evidence was inadmissible. But the damage was already done. Alex's attorney turned to the judge. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, we move to dismiss all charges against my client immediately. Judge Holloway was trapped. His face remained unreadable, but Alex saw the tension in his jaw, the flicker of desperation in his eyes. If he refused, he'd expose himself. If he granted it, he'd be admitting the entire case was built on lies. He had no way out. With forced calm, Holloway exhaled through his nose and nodded. Motion granted. Gasps rippled through the room. The cuffs were removed from Alex's wrists. She stood slowly, deliberately, locking eyes with Daniels, who sat frozen at the prosecution's table. His face was pale, his fingers gripping the edge of his chair like he was lowering her voice so only he could hear. You should have killed me when you had the chance. Daniels flinched, just a fraction, but it was enough. He knew it was over. Within minutes, the scene spiraled even further. Federal agents, real ones, stormed into the courtroom, their badges flashing as they moved toward the prosecution's side of the room. Daniels, the lead prosecutor, and 2 officers who had testified against her were pulled from their seats. You're making a mistake, Daniels hissed as the agents grabbed his arms. You can't. You have the right to remain silent, an agent interrupted, already snapping cuffs around his wrists. It was poetic. Alex turned to Judge Holloway, whose face had gone completely still, like a man trying to decide his next move. You're next, she said softly. For the first time, Holloway's mask cracked. Alex didn't wait to see what happened next. She walked out of the courtroom, past the reporters shouting her name, past the flashing cameras, past the city that had tried to bury her. By the time she stepped outside, the air was crisp, fresh, free. She had won, but there was still work to do. There were still more names on that list. She wasn't finished yet. The air outside the courthouse was cold, but Alex barely felt it. Reporters shouted questions, microphones shoved toward her, cameras flashing in rapid succession. She didn't acknowledge them. This wasn't about publicity. It never had been. Her freedom was just the beginning. She moved through the crowd, her pace steady, purposeful. The city had tried to swallow her whole, but she had burned her way out. A black SUV idled at the curb, and as she approached, the back door opened. She slid inside without hesitation, the door shutting behind her with a quiet click. Inside, a man in a suit sat across from her. He wasn't part of the agency, at least not officially. His presence here meant one thing. This wasn't over. You made quite a mess, he said, watching her carefully. Alex met his gaze without flinching. I cleaned up their mess, he nodded as if conceding the point. The arrests will hold. Daniels, the prosecutor, half the officers in that unit, they're finished. Holloway is already in negotiations for a deal, but he exhaled, shaking his head. We both know there's more. Alex leaned back, staring out the tinted window as the city blurred past. He was right. The people she had exposed were just the front-facing corruption, the easy targets. But there were bigger players, ones who had let men like Holloway and Daniels operate because it benefited them, and those people were still out there. She turned back to the man. What are you offering? His lips curled slightly, like he had been waiting for her to ask. A choice. He pulled a slim file from his briefcase and slid it toward her. Alex flipped it open. Inside were names, locations, connections. Not just cops, judges, lawyers, businessmen, people who had built the machine that had almost destroyed her. You can take the easy road, he continued. We'll clear your record. give you a quiet post, a normal life. Alex's fingers traced the edge of the file. And the other option, his gaze sharpened. You go deeper. She closed the file, considering. She had been erased once before. It would be easy to disappear for real this time, to start over, to walk away. But that wasn't who she was. They had wanted her buried. Instead, she had come back stronger, smarter, more dangerous. She slid the file back toward him. When do we start? The man smiled. The SUV disappeared down the street, taking Alex toward her next mission, her next target, her next fight. She wasn't just exposing corruption anymore. She was hunting it, and this time she wouldn't stop until the whole system burned.